keep yourself muted and just have a good time. It's our last session before the business meeting. So make sure you plan on coming to that. So, Zachary?
All right, well, welcome everybody. In case you didn't already know, this is the session on identity and expansionism. We have two fantastic speakers coming up, and I'm going to introduce our first one, and we're going to have the talk. We'll do Q&A, and then we'll go to the second speaker and do a second session of Q&A after that. So our first speaker is Joseph Orozco from Oregon State University, and he will be presenting Reimagining America and Civic Identity through Chicanx History. So I'll turn it over to you, Joseph.
Thanks, Zachary. I appreciate it. Nice to see everyone. And thank you, Court, for holding court and getting everything underway here. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. Fantastic conference. So I'm looking forward to the business meeting in a little bit. But so let me share a screen. Okay. What I'm going to try to talk about today is the idea of patriotism and the ways in which some mainstream political philosophers are envisioning trying to reconceptualize this idea in a way that can be helpful to ease the kind of polarization that we are experiencing in the world today. And I want to talk a little bit about the work of Stephen Smith at Yale University, who has released a new book called Reclaiming Patriotism in an Age of Extremes. And I want to try to understand his notion of enlightened patriotism as a way to heal the rifts of extremism. But what I'm going to try to argue ultimately is that his idea for reconceptualizing patriotism doesn't work. And my suggestion is that we would be better served if we looked at the work of a different theorist, someone by the name of Elizabeth Martinez, or Betita Martinez, who passed away earlier this year. She was a Chicana feminist writer and journalist and social theorist. And towards the end of the 1990s, she started to do a lot of different work in trying to offer a vision, so to speak, of a better way of imagining America that I think could be very useful for our purposes today. So I want to think about the possibility of reimagining America and civic belonging through using Chicano history. So that's the sort of overview that I want to take a look at. So I want to talk a little bit about the January 6th insurrection. So in this image here, this is Jacob Chansley. Before January 6th, he was an infamous QAnon supporter in Colorado and Arizona. He gained national attention when he led a group of Capitol rioters while he was wearing the horned hat and parading a flag that was tied to a metal spear. He later told federal investigators that he came to DC to heed President Trump's call, quote, to all patriots to come and to defend their country, close quote. In Chansley's statement, we begin to witness, I think, the way in which the language of patriotism has become associated with a kind of political engagement on behalf of a very particular political project, namely on behalf of President Trump's regime of power and the movement of some Republican officials to keep a Republican majority. We see this kind of language being taken over by many different Republican politicians, the language of patriotism. For instance, in February of 2021, Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson said that the Capitol rioters were, quote, simply people who love this country. Again, emphasizing the love and care, these feelings that we normally associate with patriotism on the part of those folk who came to Washington, D.C. Representative Paul Gosar called the defendants peaceful patriots, despite, of course, the fact that 5 police officers were killed by demonstrators and many, many were harmed. Asked to reflect on the riot in July 2021, President Trump said, quote, "It was a loving crowd too, by the way. There was a lot of love." Recalling the sentiment that he expressed after the 2017 Charlottesville riots, in which white supremacist protesters menaced the town and one of them killed a counter-protester by running her over. This recalls his statement when he said that there were good people on both sides of the issue in Charlottesville. In his recent book, Reclaiming Patriotism in the Age of Extremes, Stephen B. Smith maintains that our contemporary moment of political polarization and instability is partly due to the fact that we don't have a collective sense of loyalty to a national community. These ways of talking about patriotism that I've mentioned here reflect a missing component of our national life. So Smith seeks to provide a unifying concept of American patriotism that is not the same thing as what he considers the ethno-nationalism of the conservative right. And at the same time, he wants to criticize what he calls the cosmopolitan disregard of national allegiance by the left. So for Smith, American patriotism consists of two distinct components. One, a commitment to certain principles of liberal democracy, such as liberty, equality, the rule of law, etc. And two, a collective history of the traditions and stories of the American people embodying and applying those principles. This robust concept of patriotism, Smith maintains, allows us to have an inclusive community of devotion to democratic values, to which anyone now and in the future may belong. But at the same time, it's a concept that honors the sacrifices and the struggles of people in the past to make American democracy what it is today. Now, using the work of Chicana social theorist Elizabeth Martinez, I argue that Smith's notion of American patriotism is inadequate to the task of guiding us through the problem of political polarization in the US today. I maintain that Martinez's recommendations instead, garnered from years of observing grassroots social movements in the United States, can help us to understand and to navigate better the controversies at the center of US American national identity, such as the movement for Black Lives, the rise of the alt-right, and the debate over critical race theory in public education, than Smith's recuperation of American patriotism. So let's talk a little bit about Smith's idea of patriotism. For Smith, patriotism is a kind of love or loyalty or a kind of care to one's own nation. In Smith's view, the conservative right has weaponized patriotism by identifying the nation with a particular ethnic identity, namely white Europeans. Such a move creates a politics of suspicion, with enemies threatening the in-group, more and more associated with a certain kind of European heritage. On the other hand, the left, particularly what Smith calls the multicultural left dispenses with the idea of patriotism altogether in favor of some cosmopolitan idea. For the left, according to Smith, patriotism smacks too much of nationalism and of racism, understandably so, since this project is moving so strongly nowadays. So in his view, the left rejects patriotism in favor of belonging to some kind of nebulous community of abstract humanity. For Smith, both of these options are what he calls dehumanizing. The right turns citizens into civic enemies in a savage battle for survival with one another. And the left, however, seeks a community and a globalized humanity that simply just does not have a home anywhere on Earth. So Smith wants to give us a way of thinking of patriotism that avoids both of these dead ends. And so he calls his alternative enlightened patriotism. So for Smith, American patriotism at its best has not been about loyalty to a particular ethnic heritage. So some have in the past understood it that way, and some are trying to do that now, or to preserve that understanding of American patriotism. Smith believes that instead, American patriotism is best understood in the way that Swedish sociologist Gunnar Myrdal explained it in the late 1940s, that America is a creedal nation, that there is a creed that defines American citizenship. One can become American by avowing these principles in the American creed: equality, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and so on. Some theorists today, such as Jürgen Habermas, call this constitutional patriotism. a sense of loyalty to a particular form of government and its foundational values and principles. And Habermas uses this idea as a way to sort of overcome the sort of way in which German patriotism has always been associated with a certain kind of notion of blood and heritage that led so much to the Holocaust. So he started to talk about this idea instead as a reform of constitutional patriotism, patriotism to democratic ideals and liberal government. But for Smith, such constitutional patriotism is not enough, since there are many nations in the world that espouse these same kinds of values. He thinks American patriotism is different than other nations, and from cosmopolitanism, which is also a way of caring for universal principles he wants instead to value rich narratives of citizens embodying these values in their own communities. And so he takes that part of what makes someone an American citizen is that they have grown up in what de Tocqueville called the habits of the heart within American society. There are various sorts of traditions, ways of thinking, processes of memory that Americans display as exhibiting their rootedness in American democracy. So Smith writes the following, quote, "Ours is a peculiarly principled patriotism grounded in certain higher truths, such as the commitment to equality, the protection of individual rights, and the aspiration to freedom, contained in our most precious founding documents. These principles are not, strictly speaking, ours, but belong to all peoples at all times, anywhere. They are the property of humanity. But American patriotism is not defined exclusively by these commitments. It is also rooted in our history and collective memory, in the stories we tell about ourselves as a people. It is not only of logos, rational appreciation and understanding of these principles, but also of ethos. These stories tell us who we are, where we have come from, as well as who we want to be and what we aspire to," close quote. So this is Smith's notion of enlightened patriotism, that he wants a kind of understanding of patriotism that captures both what the right and the left are trying to accomplish, a sense of devotion to liberal egalitarian principles, while at the same time being rooted in a deep community with history of carrying out these values in some way or another. So what I want to focus in on is the discussion of ethos and the stories that tell us who we are, where we've come from, and who we want to be, what we aspire to. And I want to sort of give him show a little bit about what he considers to be examples of these stories. So what are the examples of ethos for Smith? For Smith, part of ethos of American patriotism involves recalling the ways in which presidents such as Washington, and especially Lincoln, he has a whole chapter about Lincoln's understanding of the principles and the meanings of the Constitution. But he mentions the following listed on the slide as examples of Americans who tell the best of our stories. Now, what's interesting about this is to look at this list of figures and sort of try to make sense of it. On the one hand, it sort of reads on, in terms of American literature, sort of like a list of something that you would see in a Western civic class at Yale. It's very sort of classical Western American lit. And then the poetry of Walt Whitman, Guthrie, Kerouac, Bruce Springsteen. Overwhelmingly, the people that he talks about as exhibiting the best of American ethos are male and white overall, except for the exception of Toni Morrison. So it's a very sort of interesting kind of way in which he talks about how these figures are the ones that we should turn to for stories about what it means to be an American. My sense is that this is a very peculiar kind of list, even though there's some great things. I mean, who doesn't like The Boss? But it seems to be a very peculiar list. And so in order to sort of understand my misgiving about this list, I want to turn to the work of Elizabeth Betita Martinez. So to give you a sense of who she was, many of you may not have heard of her, but Elizabeth Martinez, also known as Elizabeth Sutherland, was a scholar activist that started her work early on as a young woman in the 1950s, working for the United Nations as a researcher on questions of colonization and decolonization in Africa. She worked for the UN Secretariat on Africa. And in the 1960s, then she moved from her work at the United Nations to work as a full-time researcher for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and did a lot of reporting for them about efforts going on in the early part of the civil rights movement. After a time with SNCC, she then moved to northern New Mexico to work as a journalist about the land grant movement in northern New Mexico, where Mexican-American activists were recalling the history of dispossession of Mexican-American peoples after 1848 and trying to recoup the land that they had lost to the United Nations. She became a journalist. She founded a couple of newspapers to try to tell the story of these folk in New Mexico. She's the author of several books and many, many different essays, but most notably what she's famous for was a project that she started in the 1970s and then continued into the 1980s called 500 Years of Chicano and then 500 Years of Chicana History and Pictures. This was a really sort of revolutionary book of the time. These days, it would probably be a Pinterest board. But it was essentially just a collection of Mexican-American history from pre-Columbian to modern times, trying to capture the sense of ongoing struggle to recapture cultural identity and land that had been lost for hundreds of years, both at the hands of Spanish Europeans and then in the United States by the United States government. This became a real sort of important foundational text for lots of different Chicano studies programs all across the country. In 1998, she published a collection of essays called De Colores Means All of Us. And here she's highlighting the sort of the song De Colores, of colors, that almost everyone has heard if they've grown up, particularly if you grew up as a Mexican-American Catholic like I did. You hear the song sung all over the place, but it's a song about how all the colors of the rainbow are important, right? And so she takes this metaphor of this song as a way of trying to envision democratic community in the United States. And it was her attempt to report on and to reflect on the different kinds of grassroots social movements that were taking place, particularly in California, in the late 1990s to try to protect affirmative action, bilingual education, and so forth in California. And so I want to talk about a little bit about some of the work that she did in De Colores Means All of Us, and particularly her essay, Reinventing America, A Call for a New National Identity. In this essay, Martinez points out that for almost 15 years, starting in 1940, over 85% of all US elementary school children used the Dick and Jane series of books to learn to read. She writes, quote, in Dick and Jane, it was a house full of glorious family values, where mom cooked while daddy went to work in a suit and mowed the lawns on weekends. The Dick and Jane books also taught you that you should do your job and help others. All this affirmed an equation of middle class with whiteness, with virtue. And you see here an illustration from one version of Dick and Jane. And actually the Dick and Jane series went on quite a long time, through the 60s, even into the 70s as a reader. The figures did change starting in the late 1960s to the 1970s. You started to see a few Black friends of Dick and Jane, but overwhelmingly, this is the kind of picture that was portrayed of the Dick and Jane family for most of the 40s, 50s, and into the early 60s. What's interesting about this portrait of American families is that a similar world is portrayed in television shows at the time. such as Father Knows Best, which appeared on network television from 1954 to 1960, and then Leave It to Beaver in 1957 to 1963. For Martinez, what her sense is that for many white Americans, it's these images that encapsulate what it means to be an American family, right at the moment in which political turmoil is all around, upseating the racial balance through desegregation efforts and the beginning of the civil rights movement. For her, Martinez, when many white Americans think about what makes America great or what constitutes the American dream, it's these stories that constitute the ethos of American life, not the list of classics that Smith's offers. It's not Walt Whitman and Emerson and Thoreau and so forth. It's these kinds of pop culture images. These kinds of images, she believes, uphold a kind of myth that we need to dispel, what she calls origin myths of American democracy. In her view, we need to get rid of these origin myths within our ethos that restrict how we interpret the principles underlying US American democracy so that we can actually move to build a more just and peaceful society. This means, she believes, that we need to begin by establishing certain truths about what is the American experience. So we recently heard about the controversy over the 1619 project. There's been a tremendous backlash against this project that began with the New York Times about envisioning the start of the United States, not in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, but with 1619 when the first slaves were brought to North America. The 1619 project had this sort of immediate reaction. For instance, in his last days in office, President Trump's Presidential Commission on Education issued its report claiming that the 1619 project was full of lies and that we needed a kind of patriotic education for children. And the report was meant to provide a background about what was good history versus bad history. Throughout most of the summer, we've seen the passing of legislation and policy in places like Florida, Texas, and Idaho, among others, banning the use of the 1619 project and what they call critical race theory as frameworks for learning US history. Just this past week, a Republican Texas representative announced that he was asking school systems in Texas to report on whether they used a list of 850 books. Many of them are about US American history from an African American standpoint. They include the 1619 project book, and he wants to know whether or not these books are being used because in his view, they essentially promote a certain kind of view of history that makes children feel guilty for things that they need not feel guilty for, namely past American racism. Martinez argues that we need more than just the 1619 project to properly be able to understand and to assess the ethos of American society. She says we need to understand the real pillars of nationhood. For her, this would involve not only the 1619 project with the enslavement of African American people, but also the genocide of indigenous communities. So we need a 1830, right? Here you see represented in a painting from the Cherokee Nation, the Cherokee Trail of Tears. And 1848, which is the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which put an end to the war between the United States and Mexico that led to the United States annexing 50% of Mexico's territory and constituting finally the path from the Atlantic to the Pacific for the United States. In Martinez's view, we cannot understand the establishment of this country without understanding how African slaves provided cheap labor, how genocide and displacement of indigenous people opened up land to serve as property and resource development, and how imperial design grounded in manifest destiny led to hemispheric dominance of the United States. It would be impossible to understand currently where we sit in the United States without being able to appreciate this history and to understand the suffering that took place in and among all of these communities to be able to achieve the work that we now call United States Project. Let me start to wrap this up then. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I was just letting you know that we're right up on time, so if you could go ahead and wrap up.
Yeah, I'm going to start wrapping up. So what does she want to do then? What's her prescription? For Martinez, coming to terms with these pillars means to clear the way for a new origin narrative, a new ethos. And so she writes this, quote, "A new origin narrative and national identity could help pave the way to a more livable society for all of us, a society based on cooperation rather than competition, on the idea that all living creatures are interdependent and that humanity's goal should be balance. Such were the values of many original Americans deemed savages. Similar gifts are waiting from other despised peoples and traditions. We might well start by recognizing that America is not the name of an entire hemisphere rich in stunning varieties of history, cultures, and peoples, and not just one country." And so she recommends that we should stop talking about American history, American philosophy, and start to recognize that when we talk about Americans, we're talking about US Americans. She recommends that we talk about, that be the preface that we do. And this is a practice that I've done in my last two books, actually. When I talk about Americans, I talk about US Americans. I don't even speak about North Americans because that's unfair to Canadians and also to Mexicans, which is Mexico also being in North America. So she says we need to start thinking about this kind of vision that would ground us in a different sense of what the project is, that the Americas are a project of democracy, not just the United States. In some of my other work, I've also looked at the ways in which we can look at the revolutions of Latin America as similar experiments in democracy that were inspired by what happened in 1776, but in some ways, particularly for instance in Mexico, went way beyond in terms of providing social and economic liberty than the United States has ever up to this date provided. So let me conclude by saying this then. Part of what she says in her work, Martinez does, is that our commitment should be to trying to remember something ancient and to imagine something new. And something old means the best of our indigenous traditions, honoring balance and respect for all living creatures. This is for her represented by the Ojibwe origin tale of Turtle Island, a land without borders. And the something new, she's influenced here, I think, by the work of the Zapatistas in Mexico and their struggle against the Mexican state. A vision of a new community that we can pledge loyalty to that, quote, abolishes the prevailing definition of the United States as a nation with a single European American culture and identity. We must then imagine it as a community of communities that recognize their interdependence and relate to each other on the basis of mutual respect, close quote. So this is part of what I think that she wants to do, is to see how we can learn from actual social movements on the ground, not only in the United States, but throughout the Americas, for thinking about a way in which we can think of a community to which we can be devoted to. And the American project for so long, the US American project, has been very restricted and narrow. I think that we are at a moment in which there are many people who are interested in this kind of conversation and discussion. And I think that Smith is trying to facilitate this conversation with his notion of enlightened patriotism. But I think that the way in which he talks about these stories underappreciates the deep level of contestation that's going on with these accounts of our history, and that we really need to engage quite seriously with the stories that we tell of who we are, where we've come from, and where we want to go. And I think that the source for looking about where we want to go may be in what Martinez calls despised traditions. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Right, a round of applause for our speaker. That was fantastic. And I think I'm going to usher us directly into Q&A. So as usual, raise an electronic hand if you have a question. I'll look for physical hands too and anything in the chat, and I'll just help moderate those questions. But yeah, feel free to put a hand up if you have something in mind for our speaker. I think I see a hand over there from Russell. Go ahead.
Yeah, just thinking about where to go to the next level. Does anybody talk about the role of ritual in this notion of patriotism and what new rituals of patriotism might look like?
Yeah, so this is a good question. I think that Smith does recognize the importance of ritual, and he says that these are part of the ethos of American democracy. So for him, when he talks about the importance of ritual, though, he talks about the importance of saying the Pledge of Allegiance and honoring that, and you know, the flag and all of those kinds of typical notions of American patriotism, which again is striking to me because he doesn't really sort of acknowledge how those are deeply contested, right? The whole Kaepernick sort of story in the past 5 years or so is precisely about the question of how do we honor these traditions and these rituals. And so I think that, you know, there's something important, I think, that Smith is trying to do in his work. The problem is I think he really underestimates like how the way in which his theory doesn't really deal with the structural injustices that are part of American history. He sort of recognizes, he says, look, patriotism should be able to recognize this, and we don't want, you know, we don't want a history that can't acknowledge past injustices. But I think that Martinez is saying the weight of these injustices is so big that I think they do create sort of epistemic blocks for many white people to be able to appreciate a different imagining of American patriotism. And so the January 6th insurrection, I think in a certain kind of way, there have been many different scholars who have been noticing this, is one series of events in what's called demographic status threat, that large groups of white people are starting to have these kinds of fear-driven reactions to the prospect of losing demographic majority in the United States. And there's all sorts of destructive behaviors that are being manifest, suicide rates for white Americans increasing and all these kinds of things. And that some folks are saying January 6th was one example of this kind of lashing out of a feeling of powerlessness, of loss of community in the face of a growing multiculturalism, a growing sort of darker horde from the South coming forward. And so I think that the project, the impetus behind Smith's work is important, but I think that Martinez is right, is that dealing with these stories is really crucial. And in order to begin this kind of work, we're going to have to clear away lots of indoctrination, right? Quite cultural indoctrination that's been going on for the past 50 years, telling white families about who they should be and what they are. And, you know, I think that for many white folk, these stories weren't true either, right? But nonetheless, they sort of are a kind of beacon of what we could have been and what we were for some people, now what we want to get back to. And I think that that's dangerous.
All right, I've got Jen next.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. I really enjoyed it. So I think my question follows up of Greg's, because I'm just thinking about how, like, part of what's at issue, I take it, right, is this idea that if the United States is a creedal nation, right, if it's something like that, like, part of what's going on isn't only the contestation of history then, right? It's also a contestation of these ideas itself, right? Like, what does equality mean, right? And so I'm just thinking through, like, is that something we can get at through stories, right? Or does that involve an even deeper sort of investigation, right? Because now it's not only about contested history, right? It's also about contesting what's in the creed itself. So I just was wondering if you could talk a little more about that.
Yeah, no, I think that that's true, and sort of that's something I wanted to be able to try to get at more in the talk itself. But I think that that's right. I mean, I've done some work in a different paper where I analyzed that this paper that I was talking about, the sort of looking at Latin America as different experiments in democracy. One of the things that the Latin American revolutions inspired in the United States was tremendous fear that slaves and other people would be empowered because of what was going on in Latin America in the early parts of the 17 and 1800s. And so after Haiti had its revolution, and then revolutions in Mexico, there was a debate that got started in the United States about whether or not the United States should recognize the revolutions in Latin America. And there were these tremendous debates in the Senate about whether or not the Declaration of Independence was a doctrine that espoused universal liberty, which would then mean that the peoples of Latin America could also aspire to that kind of equality, happiness, and so forth, or whether equality meant something else. And there were these, this is about 1819, 1820. There was a small group of Southern senators who said, look, we know that Washington or Jefferson wrote about equality, but we don't really believe what he said. He was an academic. He was not a politician. He didn't understand these issues, right? These are, so there was essentially like this white distancing away from Jefferson and saying, look, America is a slave owning nation and we will never agree to any kind of freedom for Black folk, and we will not recognize countries that do so. And this is in 1819. And so this is like a growing this is like the growing move into the Confederacy. It was a contestation about the meaning of these principles at the heart of American democracy. And so I think that part of what we are able to see if we sort of open up the story about the experiments of democracy in the Americas is we start to realize that these principles get interpreted through various kinds of stories as well. And the stories that we tell are also going to affect the way in which we interpret the principles. And so there's a story to tell about the interpretation of these principles. And there is definitely a white supremacist Southern interpretation of these meanings that goes back all the way to the very, very beginning of the foundation of the country. And that gets occluded by the kinds of origin myths like Dick and Jane and so forth. And so that's why I think that Martinez is right, is that there's a lot of clearing away that we need to do to be able to get at the storytelling about what the meaning of our democracy is.
All right. With that, we're coming up into our next speaker's time segment. So I'm sorry, Gail, but I'm going to move us into the next segment here. Thank you again to Joseph for an excellent talk and for excellent exchange replies in our Q&A. All right. So with that, that brings us to our second speaker in this segment, and that is Jean-Marie McCann. And Jean-Marie is from Frostburg State University and will be giving a talk, a presentation entitled "The Way Out of the Tragedy of American Expansionism." And with that, Jean-Marie, I'll turn the floor over to you, and we'll enjoy your talk.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Okay. Well, I want to start by thanking Kurt and Rachel for organizing this virtual conference. It allows us to remain in touch during this time of where it is not easy to meet in person. I do not have a screen to share, but I would like to be able to see my face on the screen. I believe there are technical problems shifting the screen. Okay, in any case, this paper came to me during the troop withdrawal from Afghanistan and the Taliban's occupation of Kabul. So I started thinking of all the media reporting and lamentation about how America is being humiliated by a band of uncivilized fighters, the Taliban, and how Joe Biden is failing America. Of course, the Republicans and conservatives were the main critics of Biden, but also most in the mainstream media, and some even claiming to be from the left, were very critical of Biden, even though it was the same media, the same people who were criticizing Biden were recognizing that the great majority of American people want to get out of Afghanistan due to the financial cost of the war on terror, which has really lasted not only for 2 decades, but consisted in almost 6 wars. So many wars. 2 main wars, small wars, and occasional military interventions, and which ended up really depleting America's public funds. But there is also the human cost of war, the death toll has been high in 20 years. In a report, a special issue was published by the nations following that sudden withdrawal from Afghanistan. And it indicated close to 1 billion, actually between 897,000 and 928,000 people have died in all these wars combined, not just the Iraq and the Afghanistan war, but all these wars and conflict combined in 20 years. These were wars which were enlisted, triggered by 9/11. In 9/11, estimate ranks between 3,000 and 5,000 people killed. Of course, 9,000 had a particular impact on the psyche of not just Americans, but the morale of many people. But compare the number of 900,000 people with 5,000 people maximum from 9/11. So much loss, so much sorrow. And in terms of the cost of war, the Nation magazines also estimates that the cost of war will ultimately rank, if you also plan to calculate the cost which will take to care for veterans, all those who have been involved in war. It will cost eventually at least $8 trillion. So, in the face of this, some people were asking to keep the troops for some time or build up, some suggesting to build up more in Afghanistan. But what really called my attention and led me to start writing this paper is that I observed a huge gulf between regular American people who have said, regardless of their ideology, whether they were Democrats or Republicans, followers of Trump or followers of Biden, who had enough of a war, enough of a poverty that the war was causing. The expenses in these wars were causing. Enough of a human suffering. I was just shocked by that gulf. That in a democracy, people vote for those who put them in power. And I was also amazed by the inconsistency which has pervaded the policies, the actions of many democratic leaders, many of whom have been since the debacle of the Vietnam War very anti-militarist, at least ideologically, and who have consistently campaigned on a non-militaristic foreign policy. But once in power, they change. They follow the common American playbook to keep up with the building up of American empire. And so I started reflecting on how American empire, the building up of American empire, become costly to American democracy. When you are in the United States, coming from another country, when you have immigrated in the US from another country, especially I've been here for over 30 years, I can see the evolution in both economic life and social norms of the United States. Many people who immigrate in the US or who have immigrated in the US over the years, whether they be capitalist or not, are at least have been at least attracted by American democratic practice, the endurance of American democracy, the rule of law, but also really by the fact that American economy has been sustainable, has been enduring. And then during the last 20 years, we witnessed the degradation in cities, in rural towns. And we're probably more shocked than American born. So that is what happened to me. And so I was very fascinated by the books, a trilogy by Chalmers Johnson, Blowback Trilogy. The first one is Blowback, which he published in 2004. The second one, which he published in 2007, is titled Nemesis, The Last Days of the American Republic. The third one, which he published in 2010 before his death, is an American historian, probably an American historian, a former US CIA man. Titled as Dismantling the Empire, America's Last Best Hope. So in Blowback, Johnson points to the problem that America suffers, the problem of empire. And that is really what called my attention. So this paper is divided into two main parts. So the first part I just sum it up is I title it as the problem of America's militaristic foreign policy as a problem of American empire. And in this part, I'm going to sum up quickly because I want to go to the second part, spend more time on the second part, which are suggestions which I make. I start in the first part. I start by showing the economic and human cost of the forever American wars, especially the war on terror we started after 9/11. Ever since Congress gave the authorization to President Bush to wage war on anyone around the world who happens to threaten the United States. And they gave him carte blanche. Only one Democratic representative voted against the authorization to use military force, and that was Barbara Lee. And she explains how she suffered ostracization and threat following her vote. Now the media have been behind her, interviewing her, because she happened to be the only one who predicted it right. That it was a mistake to give such power to a president to wage war without looking at all possible consequences of such a war. And so the first consequence is the human cost and the economic cost. And part of the human and economic cost which I want to point to is poverty. The increase in poverty and unemployment resulting from the lack of investment. Priorities, so many priorities that Democratic leaders, I'm really thinking mostly about the Democrats because the Republicans have been consistent about their militaristic posture and policies. They have not been inconsistent at all. The Democrats are the ones who have really been inconsistent. Well, one can say that former President Trump was the exception to the Republican rule in terms of militarism, because like Joe Biden and Barack Obama, he campaigned on ending the wars, which he called the stupid wars, and to bring American troops home in order to invest in America. That is the platform on which Obama won the presidency. Unfortunately, Obama continued the same policy as his Republican predecessors. In 2011, started the first troop surge in Afghanistan. Joe Biden campaign against the war in 2019-2020 presidential campaign. But he had to spend time apologizing on his vote to authorize President Bush to wage a war in Iraq. And many progressives have never forgiven Hillary Clinton, who, as a senator and as Secretary of State, has been viewed as a word monger, and especially when they joined Senator Sanders, they made sure that Hillary would pay the price, and she probably paid the price more than any other politician regarding the war, her support for the war, and especially for troop surge in Afghanistan. Joe Biden was able to sell his anti-militaristic posture recently because he was able to argue that he was one of a few in Obama's administration who had opposed the different troop surges starting in 2011 to Pakistan, to Afghanistan. But Joe Biden too has been inconsistent in continuing to support the same kind of regimes which have been carrying US militaristic policies in the Middle East, especially in North Africa and Asia. At least, however, he has the courage to have listened to American people, and especially to pay attention to the danger, the economic danger at least, of imperialism, and acted upon it by withdrawing from Afghanistan. So beside the cost in human toll and financial cost, there is the reality that these forever wars, all these interventions, and including especially also something that many people tend to overlook, the proliferation of American military bases around the world, all that tends to divert resources from other national priorities, especially in terms of economic investment. And some of these national priorities are the ones now that finally, after more than 20 years, the Democrats are decided to help fund through the Build Back Better, which is being bill which is being debated in Congress. Let me in this first part, before I go to the second part of suggestions, point to the way in which the forever wars of started in 2001 after 9/11, or so-called wars on terror, have had a long-term impact on America as an empire. In this paper, I argue, following Chalmers Johnson, that indeed those multiple wars and overstretching presence around the world, militaristic especially, not diplomatic, militaristic presence around the world, really undermine, instead of ensuring the national security of the United States, it undermines all those wars and belligerent activities undermine in the long term the national security of the United States. In which way? First of all, many military analysts, including from an article which two former army generals and colonel wrote. One of those is Colonel Lawrence Wilkinson. They published an op-ed following the withdrawal from Afghanistan, where they strongly advocated ending the authorization to use military force. They pointed out that whenever America has been militarily involved or engaged in any war, America has to expect a blowback. That there is no domination, no occupation, no invasion without a counterattack, without retaliation. And so this is really part of what undermines America's security. And what is noticeable is that during these 20 years, there have been more proliferation of terrorist groups abroad, of course, also now at home, but more terrorist groups abroad than there have been, than there were in before 9/11.
Professor, forgive the interruption. I just want to let you know we're coming up against time, and I want to save enough time for people to ask you questions as well. So if you could wrap up in about the next minute, that would be ideal.
Oh, sorry. So let me go to suggestion quickly. So in terms of suggestions of in the face of the danger of American empire, which, well, first of all, Chalmers Johnson suggests that just like the British, America should jettison its empire in order to save democracy both abroad and at home. Abroad because we are forced to, America abroad is forced to cooperate with corrupt regimes or oppressive regimes, tyrannical regimes, and it is not only the leaders of those regimes which have to suffer blowback. America suffers blowback. And I myself am making the following suggestions. The first one is that America must give up its imperialistic posture and policy and become and be regarded as a force of good in the world, rather as a threat and a force of destruction. This implies that America can do so by ending the Manichaean governing mentality and ideology of us versus them, of the good versus the bad guys, cultivated by fanatical evangelical Christianity and Hollywood movies. that America must become more inclusive and accepting of those around the world and in its own society who see things differently. And part of becoming a force of good is that America must institute the teaching of tolerance both in all platforms of civic education and in school. The next suggestion I make is that America must adopt a foreign policy that seeks lasting peace and stability in our world by moving away from the ideology of American or Western exceptionalism. For the belief in exceptionalism is attached to the belief in inherent superiority of or the will to power and domination. For if we believe that we are inherently superior or exceptional, then we will also tend to believe that it is our responsibility to manage the lives of those deemed inferior, and that it is in their best interest and for the interest of everyone else that those deemed inferior must obey our orders. As Aristotle in the Politics advised slaves in relation to their masters or women in relations to men. It is in the best interest of women to obey men. It is in the best interest of slaves to obey women. The truth is that knowledge, both in the production and acquisition of knowledge, is shaped by people's conditioning in space and time. It follows that the inclusion of the other will very likely enrich our own perspective of the world. The inclusion of a perspective of the other amounts to the symbolic addition of a new window to our world, for it opens up the possibility of seeing a new angle of a world that we could not see from our limited posture in the world. That new window created by the perspective of the other brings more light, more sunlight in our room, as well as additional fresh air to our room. The next suggestion that I make is that cooperation and partnership with other nations must be adopted by American foreign policy as equal, even if America is economically and militarily more powerful and has more prestige and influence in the world than other nations. Treating all countries as America's allies is to America's long-term interests. For, as Thomas Hobbes says in Leviathan, when describing the fictional state of nature, no one is ever so powerful or powerful enough to always escape the machination of the weaker parties when those weaker parties combine their intelligence and forces to defeat the powerful at a time when the powerful least expect it. The fifth suggestion that I'm making is that America can become the world's role model and should seek to become the world's role model without ceasing to be an economic superpower. It can remain a superpower without imperialistic ambitions and conquest or ambition for conquest and domination. As such, America's leadership and role model status must be a moral leadership of democratic values, because democratic values are turned asunder by the building up of empire where corruption prevails. And part of being that role model is that America must be an advocate of fairness and human equality, including economic equality, must be involved, deeply involved in the struggle for the abolition of poverty, or at least to limit poverty. Part of being role model also is fighting for
Professor,
freedom.
I apologize to interrupt you again. I do want to let you know that we're about to come up on time for people to start migrating over to the business meeting. So if you have any concluding remarks, go ahead and make those now, and we'll wrap up here.
Okay, the concluding remark is really, in order for America to achieve its status in the world as a democratic role model and move away from the bankrupt model of imperialism, what can make that possible is coalition building from ground up, and the moral and selfless leadership that can emerge from that. In other words, when we see the way Congress works, when we see the way politicians serve the interests of the powerful, including of corporations, there is no way you can expect change from the top. It has to come from ground up. But all that entails the building up of coalition, of different forces, of different groups, of people who see the world differently, including people who see themselves as enemies or former enemies. And part of realizing that coalition building will be based on education of the younger generation. Many people have mentioned peace education, and I believe that it is very important, both in school and in any other forum. And peace education with the teaching of philosophies and spirituality, such as mindfulness, such as the best teaching of great religions of Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and all others, Confucianism. So the leadership that will emerge from that, from this coalition building, will be a moral leadership, a selfless leadership, which has been advocated by countless philosophers and spiritual leaders, from Buddha to Socrates, Plato, Jesus Christ, Confucius, and many others. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Marie. I wish we had some time for some Q&A, but Zachary?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jean-Marie, for that excellent talk. Round of applause, everybody. Unfortunately, we're coming up right against time for everyone to be able to